Hello and welcome. My name is Savannah Crookston, and I conducted a case study on poverty throughout the K-12 experience. I will begin with an introduction of my interviewee and his experiences living in poverty while attending schools. Then I will move on to the themes I noticed during the interview. Next, I will dive into the culture of poverty and in general terms, and those within the education system of terms of my interviewee. Then I will discuss the cross cultural connections between general poverty and how it affected my interviewee. And lastly, I will provide insight and recommendations on how educators could be more inclusive of children living in poverty and how my own teaching practices might change. So let's get into it. I interviewed a young man who we will call Dean. Of course, this is not his real name and it has been omitted for privacy considerations. He was born and raised in what we're going to call small town Tennessee and then moved to what we're going to call big city Colorado when he was in middle school, close to where he currently resides now with his wife and their unborn baby. Dean is now 29 years old and is the youngest of four siblings. His mom and dad divorced and separated when he was very young, and he liked being with his dad more because he felt his dad cared more about him. When I asked him why he thought that his dad cared for him more, he replied that his dad, quote, cared for me because I am a boy and my dad is sexist, end quote. Dean's dad worked in construction and his mom was either a stay at home mom or she worked as a supervisor in a golf and country club throughout his childhood. He and his family lived in significant poverty, and he said he didn't even realize that he was living in poverty until he was older. When I asked why he thought that was the case, he said, quote, "My siblings protected me from it," end quote. Dean explained that his siblings would distract him from knowing they were poor by telling him they were camping or traveling when they would stay in a tent or a hotel. He said he vividly remembers living in a hotel for a long time and he thought it was just for fun. He didn't realize they were poor even when they were living in homeless shelters. Dean went on to reminisce about playing with his siblings outside with whatever they could find to keep them entertained, how well his dad treated him, how much they moved around, and that he thought he had a pretty good childhood compared to others. Dean entered the K-12 education system in 1999 until approximately 2012 when he ultimately dropped out of high school in 10th grade. He did eventually obtain his GED and is now in college in an aviation program. He told me that he had been to several dozen schools throughout his K-12 experience, and one time he attended 3 different schools in just 2 weeks. They moved around due to his dad's work, and he remembers not going to school for some periods of time, and some days he just didn't go at all. Dean told me that he remembers struggling all throughout school and that it seemed as if no one cared about his success until he got into college. He said he was in special education classes until he entered middle school and moved to Colorado, where they, quote, just tossed me right in with everyone else and expected me to know everything, end quote. I asked him if he remembers being in general education in a general education classroom and receiving special education services, or if he was pulled out of the classroom and went to a different classroom, or if he was just in a special education class altogether. Dean said, quote, I was pulled out and it was embarrassing, end quote. He went on to explain how when the teachers would pull him out of class, the other students would see it and knew he was receiving special education services, and they would make fun of him. He said they would tease him on the playground, and it was so bad that he didn't have many friends. I asked Dean what it was like while he was in special education, and he said, um, I'm sorry, let's go back. I asked Dean what he was in special education for, and he said it was for speech, reading, and math. He was just not good at any of it from the start. So I did some research on this small town Tennessee and big town Colorado, and both places were where Dean attended school. And I found some interesting differences in their education systems. I'll use 6th grade information since that was the grade Dean moved states in. In mathematics, small town Tennessee expects sixth graders to know the number system, ratios and proportional relationships, expressions and equations, and statistics and probabilities. Big town Colorado expects the sixth graders to know all of the above, but plus geometry. Then, in reading and writing, small town Tennessee expects sixth grade to know themes of literature, have the ability to comprehend nonfiction literature, know informational text used in research and to support arguments, and to improve on their words, sentences, and content knowledge. Big Town Colorado expects sixth graders to know oral expression and listening, analyzing literature, writing and composition of argumentative or informal texts, and the ability to plan, draft, edit, and revise text, and to know how to pose a research question and follow through with it to the findings. Though they may not seem all that different, it was obvious in the breakdowns that Big Town Colorado expected a little more from sixth graders than Small Town Tennessee did. And this is in correlation to what Dean mentioned when he said he felt as if he was behind when he moved to Big Town Colorado. In looking at the information and listening to Dean's experience, I'm struggling to figure out why Big Town Colorado did not keep him in special education classes or offer to help him any more than just telling him he needs to figure it out. I also question if Small Town Tennessee was following a true IEP when they were moving him throughout the grades. If there was a true IEP, then Big Town Colorado would have had to honor it, yet it seemed as if they either didn't honor it or they didn't have one. From my interview with Dean, there were three themes that emerged that I believe helped him through his K-12 schooling as a child of poverty. Even though he didn't finish school, those themes were his siblings, his parents, and his participation in special education services. Before, during, and after my interview with Dean, he mentioned the following statement several times. Quote, "I was treated a lot better than the rest of them. I was sheltered from a lot of it and given a lot better." End quote. And, quote, "I was definitely treated differently, and I know that my siblings kind of covered for me over the years to shelter me from the things. Overall, I don't remember my childhood being too terribly bad. I remember a lot of happy times." End quote. Dean said he learned only a couple years ago that his oldest sister and mom would often go without food or comfort, so he and his other siblings would have food and the best place to sleep. Dean said he had an older half brother who was not really in their lives because he was in and out of jail. Aside from him, Dean had two other sisters who were watching out for him, and it sounds like his older sister really took on the responsibility to protect and shelter him and their other sister. Dean offered the following story, quote, "When I was around 4 years old, I remember a Christmas where we all woke up early and we actually had a tree. A lot of the years we never had trees, but we had a tree that year, and I got a bicycle that day. I remember seeing presents in front of it, and I remember it was a nice Christmas. After one of my sisters recently talked to me, I only now realized that that specific Christmas was the day that my father got the SWAT team called on him because he was throwing stuff and hitting one of my sisters. We were huddled into the bathroom, and she was trying to stop him from getting to us." End quote. It truly sounds like his siblings, especially his older sister, sheltered him to ensure he had the best life possible in and out of school. Along with this, his siblings being a theme, Dean's parents were also another theme to his educational success. As he stated above, he was treated better than his siblings by their dad, and he would get more than they would. And Dean offered this following story about his mom. Quote, "One of the memories that stuck with me was I remember one night at dinner, we were eating spaghetti, and my mom was sitting at the table. She didn't have any food in front of her. She would always ask if we had enough or if we were full. I would always say, 'Yeah, I'm full.' But looking back now, I realized we didn't have enough food for everyone to eat, and she would give it to us to make sure that we had enough food." End quote. While this story didn't go specifically in line with his education, I would say his mom's actions here were directly impacting Dean in a positive way, so he could go to school and not be so grumpy or sluggish from being hungry. Dean's dad also aided him. He told me the following story, quote, With my dad moving to different places to go to work, we could never stay in one spot for more than probably a year. I remember changing schools 3 times in 2 weeks. End quote. Sure, Dean moved a lot with his dad and attended several dozen schools, but his dad ensured he was enrolled in school. He was doing the best he could with what he had. Furthermore, Dean spoke a lot about being in special education while in elementary school. And this shows that his parents were involved in his schooling because they were part of a plan to get him the extra help. Lastly, being a part of special education allowed Dean to get a foundational knowledge of content in his younger years. Dean said that he, quote, didn't really know at the time. I thought it was just a normal class, end quote, when I asked him of his time in special education. However, after going to the classes for a while, he caught on to what he was doing, and so did all the other students. Dean offered this story, quote, I guess I wasn't reading the right way and I wasn't doing math. I just wasn't catching up to the rest of the kids. From what I remember, I hated going. I just remember I know I didn't like reading as a little kid, and because kids would always find out and kind of look at you different because you were in special needs class, end quote. Clearly, he hated being part of special education because of others making fun of him and that he was doing things he didn't want to do. However, I noticed throughout the interview, Dean was able to notice the differences in having special education in school versus not having it. When he would talk about not having it, he seemed irritated that the middle school he attended just allowed him to fail. When he talked about having it, he would mention them making him do work he didn't much care for. But all in all, Dean had support systems throughout his childhood, and while they weren't all straightforward, they were still there. And just like his siblings, parents, and the education teams at his schools. So, some information on poverty. Dr. Donna Beagle is a national public speaker with her doctorate in communications. And in 2010, um, Portland State University School of Social Work dedicated their community classroom in her honor for all of the work she has done within social realms. Dr. Beagle identifies 4 life experiences to characterize poverty. Those are generational poverty, the working class poverty, immigration poverty, and situational poverty. Of these, I would classify Dean's childhood family as a mix of generational poverty and working class poverty. Dean mentioned several times throughout the interview and afterward that his family often did not have suitable housing for food. They moved around a lot to meet those needs. His dad worked but rarely had enough money to survive on, and they lived paycheck to paycheck. Furthermore, Dr. Beagle says that people living in poverty often see it as a personal deficit and that there is no hope for them, affecting their education, success, relationship, health, and for them to reach their full potential. None of which seemed to affect Dean in the long run. He seemed to pull away from the statistics of childhood poverty affecting him as an adult. The most affected by poverty are people with disabilities, those living in rural areas, children, certain ethnic and racial groups, and families who only have one adult working. For example, 8.2% of white Americans live in poverty compared to 26.8% of American Indians and Alaska Natives, 19.5% of African Americans, and 17% of Hispanics who are living in poverty. Along with that, 23% of female head of household families live in poverty compared to 11.4% of male households who live in poverty. According to the Department of Health and Human Services, children who experience poverty are at a higher risk of having developmental delays, other chronic health issues, continuing poverty into adulthood, substance abuse, and lower life expectancy. Dean does not live in poverty. He works, is married, attends college, is about to be a dad, doesn't have a substance abuse disorder, and does not have a developmental delay. Authors Robert Wagmiller and Robert Edelman, both of the National Center for Children in Poverty, state that 35 to 46% of adults who live in poverty for over half of their childhood, like Dean did, are poor well into their middle adult years. Once again, this is another statistic Dean did not fall victim to. During my interview with him, Dean spoke of a vow that he made for his future children so they did not fall to these statistics either. Quote, I have always said that once I got a family of my own, that I would never allow them to go through what I did. I'm going to try and teach them differences between how some people lived in their past versus how they live now. This is so they don't look down on kids that are different than them or the ones who are poor. You know, I don't want them to be like the kids that were like that to me. So I'm going to try to teach them the way that I grew up and that it's okay. It's not something to make fun of somebody for. I'll do anything and everything in my power to make sure my family never goes through what I did. End quote. Dean truly wants to end the childhood poverty with him so his posterity will never have to experience what he went through as a child. Moreover, he wants to ensure that his children are set up to receive a good education, one that they will enjoy attending. In schools, teachers might see the characteristics of a child living in poverty before the child tells them they are living in poverty. Those characteristics can be absenteeism, where the child's not in school for various reasons, such as lack of transportation. They could see that students are having struggles with concentration because their minds are often elsewhere due to hunger and or being tired. They might not be doing their homework in part of not having proper supplies at home, no adult oversight, or they have to help caring for their siblings. Teachers might see their grades failing because they barely understood the past content and they just passed the last grade, making it harder for them to do well in school. This can lead to them dropping out. In 2012, 7.2% of poverty-stricken high school students dropped out versus 3.9% of non-poverty stricken students. Lastly, teachers might see behavioral issues arise. This could be due to a trauma response from neglect and or abuse at home that is also affecting their typical brain development. Behaviors could be presented as being withdrawn and depression, all the way to aggression and acting out. So some cross-cultural connections are some strategies, expansions, and school improvements. Looking back through the interview with Dean, I found that having a good support system, believing in yourself, and having a growth mindset can truly shape your future, even when all the statistics say otherwise. I believe that by having these three things, anyone could fare better than those without them. For instance, English learning students, those with learning preferences, gifted and talented students, those with learning challenges, and even those from different cultures and backgrounds could all benefit from having a good support system at home and at school, believing in themselves and having a growth mindset and not perpetuate on the things that they can't do yet. Rather, they need to think about what they can do now and then work toward what they can't do yet, which means as educators, we will need to encourage this when they can't see it for themselves. Other areas we can utilize to help students in all of the above mentioned categories is to help change our schools one classroom at a time. We need to be their cheerleaders, improve our teaching strategies in universal design for learning or UDLs, differentiated learning or DLs, and sheltered instruction observation protocol or SIOP. To be their mentor, make connections to resources, teach the students to advocate for themselves, and lastly, partner with their parents. By doing so, we are able to close the gaps in academic, cognitive, behavioral, and social areas that are common for students living in poverty, or even if they have any other categories listed above. Empowerment through literacy and technology. In a world where technology is prevalent, I believe it's necessary to embrace it rather than ban it or to use it as a last resort. Sonia Nieto, professor of language, literacy, and culture at the College of Education at the University of Massachusetts, piggybacks on what I said about embracing technology. Nieto believes implementing the technology integration matrix to show multicultural inclusion and acceptance. I found that this matrix was created to move classrooms into more of a student-centered approach instead of a teacher-centered classroom. Along with technology integration, literacy integration is another great way to empower students to have a more cultural perspective. This is more than just reading a book. It is diving into a culture and getting to the heart of it. This allows the students to see themselves and their culture in the classroom, making them more motivated to learn what educators are teaching. Lastly, creating an inclusive environment. Families are an educator's friend, or so they should be. As educators, we need to find ways to be inclusive of our students and families. They have vital information to help students succeed, and if we don't, won't, or can't talk to them, we are simply doing a disservice to our students. It is up to us to reach out because it is possible that English learning families are not reaching out because they fear no one will know their language. Or maybe the same is true for other families with various backgrounds and they just fear no one will understand. Reach out and show families that you want to understand their cultures and situations so you can best help their child be academically successful. Doing so will help them earn higher grades, attend school more regularly, and encourage them to stay in school and hopefully graduate. So, how can we apply this? My teaching practices are going to certainly change after taking this course and conducting this case study. I truly thought I had a good understanding of the content before, but I have learned so much and how different styles and ideas can affect students differently. I have been able to walk away from this class knowing I gave it my all. I learned tons of new skills, and I fully intend on implementing more of them as my educator journey continues. I know I need to be more culturally aware of others, and the best way I can do that is working with the families of my students. This will give me an insight into how they believe, how they might act or react to information, and to just understand their needs a little better. Teachers can improve their teaching strategies in a UDL, DL, or PSYOP. They can integrate a PBIS or similar system into their classroom. They can be culturally aware of customs, traditions, and beliefs of their students and their families. And they can help implement more inclusive teaching practices of multiculturalism into their lesson plans. This could look like a group project, research into a culture, inviting people of other cultures to speak in their classroom, or even changing their vocabulary to be more aware of various cultures. In conclusion, this case study has gone over an interview I conducted with Dean about his experience with living in poverty while in the K-12 education system. I have discussed his education journeys, challenges, and successes, and have provided 3 themes that I saw that aided in his educational success. Furthermore, I provided information in poverty in general terms and how it can look in the classroom, along with how Dean overcame the statistics stacked against him. Lastly, I provided information educators and schools can utilize to be more multiculturally inclusive in their classrooms, how literacy and technology can also be used to enhance multicultural inclusivity, and how my teaching strategies and multiculturalism promotion will look moving forward. Thank you so much for listening to my case study. And the next 2 slides that I'm going to show are my references. So if you would like to take a look at those, and thank you so much.